Aloha colleagues, this is Dr. Gibson. Welcome to OC 6005, Scope and Methods of Research. The title of this presentation is Qualitative Content Analysis, or QCA, Part 1. One of the overall themes from our Schreier textbook is the fact that your research question points to the methodology necessary to test your question. And this idea is seen numerous times throughout the text, but I wanted to ensure that I highlight that while we will be discussing QCA for the next few weeks, please keep in mind that your research question will always be the driver in determining your research. I'd like to begin with a very general question, and that question is, what is qualitative content analysis, also known as QCA? And you'll see that throughout the textbook. They use that acronym quite frequently. So the definition is actually provided to you on page 1 of our textbook, but I'd like to go ahead and read it here. So QCA is a method for describing the meaning of qualitative material in a systematic way. You do this by assigning successive parts of your material to the categories of your coding frame. This frame is at the heart of QCA, and it covers all those meanings that feature in the description. And while I think the definition of QCA that was provided in the textbook is quite clear, what may not be clear is exactly how QCA is useful to you as a student and your research. So as researchers, we construct meaning from data, and QCA helps us to look at a large amount of data and reduce it into meaningful terms. This can be used for many different types of data. For example, interview transcripts, focus groups, textbooks, company brochures, contracts, diaries, entries on social networking sites, TV programs, newspaper articles, magazine articles, etc., etc. And one of the neat things about QCA is that it does not matter if your data is verbal. So the next question that usually comes up with students is the question of, when should I use QCA? And the textbook provides 5 general criteria for when you should utilize this methodology. The first one, when you're dealing with rich data that requires interpretation, verbal data, visual data, data that you have sampled from other sources, so that can be things such as documents, something from the internet, etc., etc. And the last one, on data that you've collected yourself, such as interviews, focus groups, etc. At this point, I'd like to go over some of the tenets that make QCA very attractive to OD specialists in particular. And overall, QCA is systematic, flexible, and reduces data. So first off, QCA is systematic because you examine all your material and decide for each part where it fits in your coding frame. The next tenet, QCA always involves the same sequence of steps. I'm going to reiterate this one, and I'm going to say it again and let it sink in. QCA always involves the same sequence of steps. And finally, in QCA, you go beyond your individual understanding at a given moment by checking whether your understanding stands the test of consistency. In research methods, that's what we call reliability. We will be discussing that in a different presentation. Next, QCA is flexible because in the sense that you will always have to tailor your coding frame to your material. And this is because you want your coding frame to be reliable and valid. So with QCA, your research question specifies the angle from which you examine your data. If other important aspects strike you during the analysis, you can change your coding frame to include these as well. And finally, QCA reduces data by focusing your analysis on selected aspects. And in this process, it reduces your material in different ways. So first, you limit your analysis to those aspects that are relevant with a view to your research question. Next, the categories of your coding frame will usually be at a higher level of abstraction than the mere concrete information in your material. And please note that you may lose information at the individual level, but you're going to gain information across cases, so at the aggregate level. Your textbook provides the steps that are necessary in utilizing a QCA methodology. Some of these steps we have already done in this course. For example, the first step that the textbook lists is deciding on your research question and selecting your material. In theory, in our research proposal, we have already done that. So I'd like to start at number 3, and that's where we will focus the majority of our time in this presentation, is on how to build a coding frame. The steps after that include dividing your material into units of coding, trying out your coding frame, evaluating and modifying your coding frame, the main analysis, and interpreting and presenting your findings. In the next several slides, we're going to discuss some of the differences between the qualitative content analysis, or QCA, and different methodologies. So for this current slide, we're going to discuss the differences between quantitative and qualitative content analysis. So for quantitative, and I'm looking at the left-hand side of the screen here, the focus is on manifest meaning. And your textbook goes into a lot of detail on the differences between manifest and latent meaning. So I will direct you to your textbook for that discussion. But next, little context is needed. There is a strict handling of reliability. Reliability checks are more important than validity checks in this particular type of methodology. At least partly, the data is concept driven, and there are fewer instances to context, author, and recipients, and a strict sequence of steps. So QCA differs a little bit. The focus is on latent meaning. Much context is needed for interpreting the data. Variable handling of reliability. The validity checks are just as important as the reliability checks in QCA. It's at least partly data-driven. There are more inferences to context, author, and recipients, and there are more variability in carrying out the different sequence of steps. So overall, qualitative research relates to QCA in a few ways. So qualitative research is comfortable with multiple meanings and interpretation and is therefore situational. On the other hand, quantitative research is interested more in drawing conclusions across multiple contexts. But in qualitative research, the quantitative criterion of objectivity does not apply. So concerning reliability, the opinions of qualitative researchers differ, so there is a debate in the literature. Some reject it altogether, some accept it for qualitative research, and some suggest a modified concept. We're next going to talk about validity and QCA. So validity is a very important criterion for assessing the quality of qualitative research, and it's generally used in two different senses. In the narrow sense, the extent to which your instruments help you to capture what you set out to capture, and in the broader sense, the overall quality of your study. So in QCA, a consistency check is built into the procedure. You either have part of your material coded by another person, or your other option is for you to recode part of your material yourself after approximately 10 to 14 days. And the rationale behind this double coding is that the idea in QCA is to arrive at an interpretation of your material that would be shared by most people with a similar cultural background. Double coding also helps you to assess. So your textbook does spend a lot of time describing the differences between coding and QCA. And with coding, we usually utilize when we are utilizing grounded theory or a different type of theory-driven research. But I am going to go through the differences between these two methodologies. So in coding, it's more analytic. So how do the categories relate? The codes are mostly data-driven. It's iterative and a very cyclic procedure. The focus is on trustworthiness and credibility, and creating and applying codes are done in one step, so the focus of code definitions is on the conceptual level. Codes are not mutually exclusive, and no segmentation is necessary. On the other hand, QCA is much more descriptive. So the question that we ask is, how does the data relate? The codes are part data-driven and part concept-driven. It's certainly a linear procedure with cyclic elements. And the focus here is on consistency. So creating and applying codes are actually done in different steps. The focus of code definitions is on how to recognize instances of the concept in the data. The subcategories for the same main category are mutually exclusive. And before coding, material must be divided into units of coding, So the QCA is a good method to use if your research question is descriptive. If your research question is focused on theory and analysis, then coding is better. Coding is also better if your material is very... Your textbook also presents a few different methodologies that still do relate to QCA, so I will go over those. Right now we will go over the differences between discourse analysis and QCA. So in discourse analysis, it's based on constructivist assumptions. It's descriptive or critical. The focus is on processes and analysis of what is and what is not there in the material. On the flip side, QCA, there are no assumptions about reality or implicit realist assumptions. So that differs from the constructivist perspective. QCA is typically descriptive, and focus is on different states. And finally, in QCA, the analysis of what is there in the material is our main focus. So discourse analysis rests on the assumption that language does not present reality, but contributes to the construction of reality. Another methodology is called semiotics. So we will go over the differences between semiotics and QCA. Therefore, Semiotics is an in-depth description of meaning. The analysis of individual specifics of each instance does occur. Different researchers may differ in their interpretation, which is the criterion of plausibility. Analysis of what is and what is not there in the material, as well as analysis of multiple meanings from one perspective. On the other hand, QCA is a description of meaning in selected respects. It really is a comparative analysis. Different researchers should agree on their interpretation, so that's the criterion of consistency. Analysis is of what is there in the material, and analysis of one meaning only from one perspective. So at a more global level, semiotics is about the analysis of signs. So a sign is anything that meaningfully stands for something else. A sign acquires meaning by the way in which. So we've discussed how QCA relates to your research. We've discussed many different other methodologies that have similar characteristics. And now we're going to get into kind of the meat of how to do a QCA. And in order to do that, we need to talk about coding frames, and specifically what exactly is a coding frame. So the definition that the text provides is a coding frame is a way of structuring your material. It consists of main categories specifying relevant aspects and of subcategories for each main category specifying relevant meanings concerning this aspect. Okay, that's not exactly the clearest definition, so let's go through an example. So usually a 1-hour interview will produce 15 pages of written transcripts. If you complete 15 interviews, your data set will be 225 pages long, which can be an overwhelming amount of data. However, because we have developed a research question, we have an idea of what we want to look for in the data, and specifically, if we've identified constructs of interest from our research question and literature review, we can build a coding frame around those. So just a quick note, the textbook calls these main categories or dimensions, and the terms are used synonymously. So once you've specified the aspects which constitute your main categories, the next step is to identify what is said in your material about these aspects. Your textbook does go into a bit of detail on the differences between concept-driven and data-driven, as well as a combination of those methodologies. So I won't go into depth here, but you will want to take a look at that in your textbook. Subcategories specify what is said about the aspects that interest you, for example, your main categories. And here we start to see how QCA helps reduce and summarize your material. You reduce the many things that are said in your material about a particular topic to these subcategories. So we might compare the main categories in a QCA to what we've been talking about are constructs, and the subcategories to the levels of these constructs. At this point, I want to reiterate what I discussed at the beginning of the presentation, so I really want this statement to sink in. Where your main categories are concerned, your research question or questions will point the way. So your research question should dictate what your main categories should be. So think about that for a second, write it down, put it in your notes, because this is very important. So I'm going to say it again. Where main categories are concerned, your research. So continuing on with describing a coding frame, essentially a coding frame acts like a filter. Material that is not covered by the main categories will no longer be visible once you've conducted your analysis. Distinctions in the material that are not covered by your subcategories will also not be visible. In conceptual terms, the complexity of a coding frame depends on your research question. In practical terms, it depends on the number of dimensions and hierarchical levels. At this point, we are going to discuss coding frames and complexity. And because a coding frame contains, by definition, at least one main category and its subcategories, that means each coding frame has at least 2 levels. At this point, it's in Chapter 4 in your textbook. The author goes into a lot of detail covering simple coding frames of medium complexity, and coding frames of high complexity. I do encourage you to take a look at the examples and diagrams that the author has provided you. As I was reading the text, I didn't find the explanations as clear, but when I went through the examples and looked at the diagrams, it was very enlightening, and it certainly did clear up any questions that I had in my mind. So please make sure that you do take a look at those. There are specific requirements for coding frames, and reliability and validity are extremely important. And so I'm not going to go into detail on those 2 things right now because they will be discussed in depth in future presentations. But I would like to direct your attention to some other requirements. And while researchers are unable to assess all of the following requirements in a study, you do want to keep them in mind as you're building your coding frame. And these 4 areas are unidimensionality, mutual exclusiveness, exhaustiveness, and saturation. So the first area, unidimensionality, means that each dimension in your coding frame should capture only one aspect of your material. So a typical beginner's mistake is mixing dimensions, and it happens quite frequently with beginners in QCA. 2 signs can help you recognize whether you are mixing dimensions. The first sign is that your subcategories cannot be considered instances of the main categories. The second sign, the names of the subcategories recur throughout the coding frame in an identical function. And again, your textbook provides excellent examples of unidimensionality, so please take a look at those, and they are on pages 71. Probably wondering at this point, why is unidimensionality important? We know that there are 2 main reasons why we should be considering unidimensionality. And the first one is that unidimensional coding frames are more parsimonious, meaning they are more clear and concise. And unidimensionality helps with building coding frames where the categories are mutually exclusive. And we'll be talking about that one next. But a typical beginner's mistake is that beginners often mix dimensions because they want to capture how the dimensions relate to each other. But there are better ways of finding out about this after you've done the coding, especially if you're using software packages that can typically. The next requirement is mutual exclusiveness, and this criteria in coding frames is that the subcategories in your coding frame mutually exclude each other, meaning that you can assign each segment of your material to only one subcategory. So specifically, your textbook provides this definition of mutual exclusiveness. It refers to the subcategories within one dimension. It means that a unit of coding can be assigned to one of these subcategories only. So it's also important to note that mutual exclusiveness also does not refer to the entire coding frame, but only to one dimension and its subcategories. So it translates into the requirement that the same unit of coding should be assigned to only one subcategory within a given dimension. And the rationale underlying this requirement is immediately obvious when you're dealing with subcategories for describing. Continuing on with mutual exclusiveness, you can meet this requirement if you choose your units of coding such that each unit fits only within one subcategory. And when you're dealing with subcategories which are not mutually exclusive by definition, this requirement is important when assessing the reliability of your coding frame. The next criteria is exhaustiveness, and the definition says a coding frame is said to be exhaustive if you're able to assign each unit of coding in your material to at least one subcategory in your coding frame. So the criterion of exhaustiveness is, in fact, the reason why each dimension in a coding frame will usually contain a miscellaneous subcategory. The final criteria is called saturation, and your textbook doesn't go into a lot of detail on this one, so I'll only provide the definition here. But the criteria of saturation requires that each subcategory is used at least once during the analysis, meaning that no subcategory remains empty. At this point, you're probably wondering, okay, I've learned about building a coding frame, but how do I come up with a structure for my own research? Which is always a great question. It's usually best to start out with your research question in mind and to identify aspects of the material that are necessary for answering this question. You can then turn each aspect into a main category or dimension. In the next step, you should create subcategories for each dimension by going through your material. In doing so, you should keep the three requirements of unidimensionality, mutual exclusiveness, and exhaustiveness in mind. And just a reminder, usually the problem is not coming up with dimensions, but to cut down on the number you have come up with. In this, you should again be guided by your research question, and know that you can always go back to the same material at a later stage and analyze it again from a different perspective. So this is the end of part 1 of QCA. Do you have any questions? Please email me if you do. I am here to help. I hope your research proposal is going along swimmingly. Again, please email me if you're stuck or if I can clarify anything. My job is to help guide you along your research proposal. So, mahalo.